For 90 days, the sun had baked the platform at Willow Creek Station. And for 90 days, Heath Norton had stood there, waiting. He was a statue carved from dust and patience, his eyes fixed on the shimmering tracks that vanished into the Wyoming heat. Every day at 2:30, he'd arrive. Every day at 3:15, he'd watch the train from St. Louis leave without her. The whole town thought he was a fool. "That Eastern woman ain't comin', Heath," Benjamin Lawson, the station master, would say. "Why torture yourself?" Heath never answered. He just leaned against the post, his silence a stubborn prayer. He'd made a promise, and Heath Norton didn't break his promises. Not for hell, and not for high water. He was waiting for a ghost, a woman he knew only from 30 letters written in a delicate, careful hand. Priscilla Anderson, his mail-order bride. Then, on the 91st day, the whistle screamed. The iron beast rounded the bend, black smoke clawing at the sky. It hissed to a stop, steam ghosting across the platform. The usual passengers got off. A salesman, a family, a young man chasing a dream. Heath's hope, a flickering candle, was about to be snuffed out for another day. And then she appeared. She stepped off the train like she was stepping into another world. Her green dress was a slash of color against the town's tired brown. She was just as her letters described. Chestnut hair, fair skin, and eyes the color of summer sage. But something was wrong. Heath took off his hat. The man in the letters had been eloquent, a rancher who could quote Shakespeare. The man standing before her was weathered, his face a roadmap of hard sun and harder work. "Miss Anderson," he said, his voice a rusty hinge. She turned. Her sage-green eyes found his, and for a split second, he saw something that wasn't in the letters. Not shyness, not hope. It was fear. Then it was gone, replaced by a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Norton," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I apologize for my tardiness. There were complications." Her hand was small in his, but her grip was firm. 3 months is more than tardiness, Miss Anderson." The smile on her face faltered. It was the first crack in the mask. "I can explain everything, I promise, but perhaps not here." He nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of the town's eyes on them. He reached for her valise, a single small leather case. He expected it to be light. It was heavy, shockingly heavy, as if it were filled with stones or solid gold. "Is this all you've brought?" he asked, hoisting it. "The rest of my belongings will arrive next week," she said, a little too quickly. I couldn't wait any longer to come. He led her to the wagon, the lie hanging in the air between them. He helped her up, her posture as straight and unbending as a fence post. She was a fortress, and he was standing outside the walls. He flicked the reins. The horses lurched forward. "You were 3 months late," he said, breaking the silence. "I was beginning to think you changed your mind about marrying a stranger." A faint blush touched her cheeks, but her eyes remained steady. "We're not strangers, Mr. Norton. We've exchanged over 30 letters. I feel I know you better than most men I've met in person." "Letters can lie," Heath said, the words sharper than he intended. Her chin lifted. "So can people. I'm here now. If you've reconsidered your proposal, I would appreciate knowing before we go any further." Her directness was a slap. The woman in the letters was demure, thoughtful. This woman was a fighter. He saw it now, a fire banked deep in her eyes. He had advertised for a wife, a partner. He hadn't advertised for a mystery. "I haven't reconsidered," he said, "but I think we should take some time. The arrangement was for you to stay in the guest cabin. It's yours for as long as you need it." Relief washed over her face. It was so profound, so sudden, that it was more worrying than her fear. What was she so relieved about? Not having to marry him right away, or just having a place to hide. The wagon rumbled out of town, leaving the whispers and the stares behind. The vast Wyoming landscape opened up, a world of rolling hills and endless sky. "It's beautiful," she whispered, but she wasn't looking at the mountains. She was looking over her shoulder, back down the road toward the train station, as if expecting to see someone following her. He had waited 91 days for his bride to arrive. Now he was wondering if he had just welcomed a storm into his carefully ordered life. The guest cabin was simple, clean. Smoke curled from its chimney, a welcoming plume against the darkening sky. Mrs. Winters, his housekeeper, had prepared it just as he'd asked. When they arrived, the older woman bustled out of the main house, her kind face wreathed in smiles. "You found her!" she called out. "More like she found me," Heath replied, helping Priscilla down. He didn't miss the way Priscilla flinched slightly when Mrs. Winters pulled her into a warm, motherly hug. "We've been waiting for you, dear," Mrs. Winters chirped. "I was beginning to think Mr. Norton had invented you entirely." Priscilla murmured her thanks, her body stiff in the embrace. Heath carried the suspiciously heavy valise into the cabin. It was a single room, cozy, with a bed tucked behind a curtain and a small stove. Wildflowers sat in a jar on the table, a touch of home in the wilderness. "It's perfect," Priscilla said, but her eyes were scanning the room, checking the windows, the single door. She wasn't seeing a home. She was assessing a hiding place. "Dinner is at 6 at the main house," Heath said, setting the valise down by the bed with a solid thud. "If you'd care to join me." "I would be delighted," she replied, her formal mask snapping back into place. He left her there with Mrs. Winters, and as he walked back to his own house, the questions swirled in his mind like dust devils. The fear in her eyes, the heavy bag, the way she looked over her shoulder. The woman in the letters wrote of partnership and building a future. The woman in the cabin looked like she was running from her past. At precisely 6, a knock came at his door. Priscilla stood there, changed into a simple blue dress. She looked younger, less guarded, but the tension was still coiled in her shoulders. She stepped inside, her eyes taking in his home. He was a rancher, but he was also the son of a New York lawyer. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with the classics he'd brought west with him. "Your home is lovely," she said, her fingers ghosting over the leather spines of the books. It was the first genuine thing he'd heard her say. "Reading passes the long winters," he said. Dinner was a tense affair. Mrs. Winters served roast beef and potatoes, her cheerful chatter filling the silence that stretched between Heath and Priscilla. He found himself studying her, noticing the small details. A tiny, faded scar near her left eyebrow. The way she held her fork with a white-knuckled grip. "Tell me about your father," he finally asked, once Mrs. Winters had cleared the plates. "You said he fell ill. That was the reason for your delay." Her expression clouded over. The mask was back. "Yes, pneumonia. For a time, we feared the worst." "And you sent letters to explain," he pressed, even though he knew the answer. "3 of them," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "The mail can be unreliable out here, I suppose." It was a perfect explanation, a reasonable one. And Heath didn't believe a word of it. He'd run this ranch for 10 years. Mail was sometimes slow, but 3 letters didn't just vanish, not without help. "You never mentioned your father disowning you for coming here," he said, shifting his line of attack. The color drained from her face. "It was a private family matter. I didn't want to burden you." "You left everything behind," he said, leaning forward. "You defied your family, traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man you've never met, and you arrived 3 months late, looking over your shoulder like a spooked mare, with a story that has more holes than a screen door. You're going to have to do better than that, Priscilla. She stood up so abruptly, her chair scraped against the wooden floor. Her composure was gone, replaced by a raw, ragged fury. "You have no right to question me," she hissed, her voice low and trembling. "Our arrangement was for marriage, not interrogation. You said I could stay in the cabin. I will accept your charity, Mr. Norton, but I will not be cross-examined like a common criminal." She turned and fled, leaving him alone in the silent dining room. The scent of her floral perfume hung in the air, a sweet smell covering something bitter. Heath didn't go after her. He walked to the window and stared out at the small cabin. A single lamp glowed in its window, a tiny point of light in the vast, dark expanse of his ranch. He had waited for a partner, a wife. He had gotten a war. And he had a terrible feeling that the first battle had just been lost. But he was also more intrigued than he had ever been in his life. Priscilla Anderson was not the woman he expected. She was something far more dangerous and far more interesting. The next morning, Heath saw her from the main house. She was outside her cabin, not exploring, but pacing, back and forth, like a caged animal. Her hands were clasped behind her back, her head bowed. He gave her space. He did his morning chores, his mind 1,000 miles away from his cattle. He spoke with his foreman, Thomas, a man who'd been with him for years, but his answers were distracted. Around mid-morning, he saw her walk towards the stables. He followed, keeping his distance. She didn't go to the horses. She went to the far side of the barn, where the road leading off his property was visible. She stood there for a long time, just watching the empty road, waiting for someone, or watching for someone. He decided it was time for the second battle. He approached her, his boots crunching on the dry ground. She didn't turn until he was right beside her. "The road only goes 2 ways from here," he said quietly. "Back to town, or deeper into my land." She didn't answer, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Running won't do you any good out here," he continued. "There's nowhere to run to." Finally, she turned to him. The fire was gone from her eyes, replaced by a weary exhaustion. She looked like she hadn't slept. "I'm not running," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Then what are you doing, Priscilla? You can't live in that cabin forever, looking over your shoulder. Whatever trouble you're in, it followed you here. I can feel it." She finally broke. Her shoulders slumped, and a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," he said, his voice softer now. "I offered you a partnership. That means sharing the burdens. Right now, you're carrying one that's too heavy for you alone." She looked at him, her sage-green eyes searching his face, looking for something. Trust, maybe. "My father wasn't sick," she began, the confession tumbling out of her. "Not with pneumonia, anyway. He had a business associate, a man named Alistair Finch, much older than me. Cruel. My father, he arranged a marriage, for business, to save his failing law practice. The story was ugly and familiar. A daughter sold for profit. I refused," she went on. "But Finch wouldn't take no for an answer. He's a powerful man in Boston. He began to stalk me, to threaten me. He told me that if I wouldn't be his wife, I wouldn't be anyone's. My father, trapped by his debts, did nothing to stop him." "So you answered my advertisement," Heath filled in the blanks. "You faked the story about your father's illness to buy yourself time to escape." She nodded, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "Yes, I was supposed to leave in April, but Finch suspected something. He had people watching me. It took me 3 months to find a way out without being followed. I never sent any other letters, Heath. I couldn't risk him intercepting them." It all made sense now. The fear, the relief, her guarded nature. She wasn't a liar. She was a survivor. "And the valise?" he asked gently. "Why is it so heavy?" She hesitated for a long moment. It's not just clothes, it's evidence, ledgers, letters, proof of Finch's illegal business dealings, my father's secret revenge. He couldn't protect me openly, but he gave me the weapon I would need to protect myself. He told me to use it if Finch ever came after me. A cold knot formed in Heath's stomach. You think he'll come after you? All the way out here? Before she could answer, the sound of an approaching rider made them both turn. A man on a fine black horse was coming up the road from town. He was dressed in Eastern clothes, a dark suit, and a bowler hat that looked ridiculous in the Wyoming sun. He rode with an unnerving confidence, his eyes scanning the ranch as he approached. He pulled his horse to a stop a few yards away from them. He was a man in his late 40s, with cold, intelligent eyes and a thin, cruel smile. Miss Anderson, the man said, his voice smooth as polished stone. He tipped his hat, but it was a mockery of a polite gesture. Alistair was so worried about you. He sent me to make sure you arrived safely. Priscilla went rigid beside Heath, her hand instinctively flying to her mouth. The blood drained from her face. The man's cold eyes shifted to Heath, dismissing him as nothing more than a piece of scenery. The name's Silas. I'll be taking the young lady back to Boston now. Don't try to be a hero, rancher. You're out of your depth. The storm hadn't just followed her. It had just made landfall on his front porch. Heath stepped forward, placing himself between Priscilla and the man called Silas. His hand didn't go to the pistol on his hip. Not yet. This was a different kind of fight. Miss Anderson is my guest, Heath said, his voice calm and even, a low rumble that carried across the dry air. She's not going anywhere. Silas's thin smile widened. He looked Heath up and down, taking in the worn work clothes, the calloused hands, the sun-beaten face. He saw a simple man, a farmer. He didn't see the son of a New York lawyer who understood contracts and threats better than most. He didn't see the man who had survived 15 years in a land that killed the weak. I have a legal contract, Silas said, reaching into his coat. He produced a piece of paper. An agreement signed by her father, Jonathan Anderson, pledging her hand in marriage to Mr. Alistair Finch in exchange for certain financial considerations. He waved the paper mockingly. It's all perfectly legal. She belongs to him. That's not a marriage contract. Priscilla's voice was sharp, cutting through her fear. That's a bill of sale, and this territory doesn't recognize slavery. Silas chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. Clever, but Mr. Finch is a very influential man. He has friends in the territorial government. A word from him, and a judge will see things his way. You can come back with me easily, Miss Anderson, or I can come back with a federal marshal and a warrant for your arrest on charges of theft. Heath's eyes narrowed. Theft of what? She stole sensitive financial documents from Mr. Finch, Silas said smoothly. He's willing to forgive her foolishness, of course, once she's returned home. It was a checkmate. They had the law, the power, the influence. All Heath had was a patch of dirt and a stubborn refusal to back down. You're trespassing on my land, Heath said. I want you gone. I'll leave, Silas said, gathering his reins. But I'm not leaving Willow Creek. I'll be at the hotel. You have 24 hours to hand her over. If you don't, I'll bring the law down on this whole operation. I'll ruin you, rancher, and I will take her anyway. He tipped his hat again and turned his horse, riding away as calmly as he had arrived. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had delivered his ultimatum. Heath and Priscilla stood in silence, watching him go. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He's not lying, Priscilla whispered, her voice trembling. Finch can do it. He'll destroy you just to get to me. She turned to him, her eyes filled with despair. You have to let me go, Heath. You can't fight him. I told you, Heath said, turning to face her. The time for caution was over. The time for waiting was over. I don't go back on my word. I offered you a partnership. That means when a wolf comes to the door, we face it together. But you don't even know me, she cried. I know you're the bravest woman I've ever met, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he didn't have a name for yet. And I know that man is not leaving my ranch with you. Not now. Not ever. He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, a tiny flame relighting in the storm. She had come west looking for a new life, for a partner. She had found a war instead, but she was no longer fighting it alone. That night the ranch house was a fortress. Heath didn't take Priscilla back to her cabin. She stayed in the guest room of the main house, the heavy valise tucked under her bed. He posted 2 of his most trusted ranch hands, Thomas and a young man named Jake, to watch the road. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Mrs. Winters, having been told a sanitized version of the truth, fussed over Priscilla, bringing her tea and blankets, her motherly concern a silent shield. Heath sat at his dining room table, a map of his ranch spread out before him, a rifle leaning against the wall. He was planning, thinking, trying to find a way out of a closing trap. Silas held all the cards, the law, the money, the power. Heath had land, loyalty, and a promise. Priscilla came and stood in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She looked pale in the lamplight. This is my fight, Heath, she said softly. You shouldn't have to risk everything for me. It stopped being just your fight the moment he rode onto my land and made a threat, Heath said without looking up from the map. He threatened my home, my livelihood. That makes it my business. He'll get a marshal, she insisted. They'll have papers. You can't fight the law. I don't intend to, he said. He finally looked up at her, and she saw a dangerous glint in his eyes. This was not just the quiet, patient rancher. This was the man who had tamed a piece of the Wild West. We're not going to fight his way. We're going to fight my way. He stood up and walked to the bookshelves. He pulled down a thick, leather-bound book, a law text from his father's library. Wyoming Territory has some interesting laws, he said, flipping through the pages, especially concerning the rights of women and the rights of property owners. He stopped at a page, running his finger down a line of text. Finch's contract may be valid in Boston, but out here, things are different. A plan was forming in his mind, a desperate gamble. The evidence in your valise, he said, turning to her. How damaging is it? It's enough to ruin him, she said. Proof of fraud, bribery, extortion. That's why he's so desperate to get it back. It's not about me anymore. It's about those papers. Good, Heath said, a grim smile touching his lips. Silas thinks he's holding a royal flush. It's time we showed him our ace in the hole. The next morning, Heath rode into town alone. He left Priscilla at the ranch under the watchful eyes of Mrs. Winters and his men, with strict instructions not to let anyone on the property. He found Silas on the porch of the Willow Creek Hotel, drinking coffee as if he were on vacation. Changed your mind, rancher? Silas asked, not bothering to stand up. I have a counteroffer, Heath said, remaining on his horse. It gave him the advantage of height. Silas raised an eyebrow, intrigued. I'm listening. You leave Willow Creek on the noon train, Heath said. You go back to Boston, and you tell Alistair Finch that Priscilla Anderson died on the journey west. You tell him the papers she carried were lost in a river crossing. You tell him whatever you want. But you never come back. You never contact her again. Silas burst out laughing. It was a loud, ugly sound that drew the attention of people passing on the street. You're in no position to make demands. The marshal from Cheyenne will be here tomorrow. The game is over. The game is just beginning, Heath said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. Because you see, Silas, you made a mistake. You assumed because I live out here, I'm a simple man. but my father was a lawyer, and I learned a few things. He leaned forward in his saddle. First, that marriage contract is worthless in this territory. A woman can't be sold, and she can't be forced into a marriage against her will. Any judge, even one on Finch's payroll, will have to admit that. Silas's smile faltered. Second, Heath continued, pressing his advantage. You threatened me. On my property. In Wyoming, a man's home is his castle. Threats made against it are taken very seriously. The sheriff here is an old friend of mine. He's not going to be happy to hear about an out-of-towner threatening one of his citizens. And third, Heath said, saving his trump card for last, those papers you're so keen to get back, we're not going to use them to expose Finch's business dealings. That's too complicated. Instead, we sent a telegram to the Boston Globe this morning, not from Priscilla. From a concerned citizen of Wyoming who discovered evidence of a white slavery ring run by a prominent Boston businessman named Alistair Finch, who buys and sells young women. The color drained from Silas's face. He finally understood. It's a lie, he hissed. Of course it is, Heath agreed calmly. But you have the contract, the one you were waving around like a trophy. It will look like proof. The newspapers will love it. A rich, powerful man from the East exploiting innocent women. It doesn't matter if it's true. The scandal will ruin him, his reputation, his business, everything. And it will all be because you couldn't leave well enough alone. Heath straightened up in his saddle. So that's my offer. You get on the noon train and disappear. Or you stay, and the story runs. Your choice. He turned his horse without waiting for an answer and rode away, leaving Silas sitting on the hotel porch, his coffee growing cold, the trap he had so carefully laid now snapping shut on him and his employer. Heath rode back to the ranch, not knowing if his bluff would work. It was a high-stakes poker game, and he had just pushed all his chips into the middle of the table. When he reached the ridge overlooking his property, he saw a rider coming from the ranch, galloping hard. It was Jake, one of his ranch hands. His face was pale with panic. "It's Priscilla!" he yelled as he got closer. "She's gone!" Heath's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, gone?" "She took a horse, rode out about 20 minutes ago, headed north into the Badlands. She left this for you." Jake handed him a folded piece of paper. Heath's hands trembled as he opened it. The note was short, her handwriting rushed. "Heath, I cannot let you be ruined for my sake. I am taking the evidence and drawing Silas away from you. This is my fight. Please do not follow me. I will be fine. Thank you for your kindness. You are a good man. Yours, Priscilla." He had won the battle in town, only to lose the war at home. She had sacrificed herself to save him, and he wasn't going to let her. "Which way did she go?" he asked, his voice tight with fury and fear. Jake pointed north. "Into the broken country. It's rough terrain, easy to get lost, even easier to get ambushed." Heath didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse, galloping toward the ranch. He yelled at Thomas to gather the men. Silas wanted a fight. Now he was going to get one. On Heath's land, on Heath's terms. The hunt was on. The Badlands were a maze of canyons and rock, a place where the earth had cracked open. It was no place for a woman from Boston on a horse she barely knew how to ride. Heath pushed his mount hard, his eyes scanning the ground for tracks. He was a rancher. He knew this land like the back of his hand. He could read the story of a turned stone, a broken branch. He found her trail easily. She was heading north, just as Jake had said. But there was another set of tracks, too. A single rider following her. Silas. He must have seen her leave the ranch. He hadn't taken the bait. He had gone straight for the prize. Heath's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't about a legal fight anymore. This was a chase. And in this country, a chase could only end one way. He rode for an hour, the sun beating down on his back. His men were fanned out behind him, a small posse moving through the canyons. Finally, he saw them. Up ahead, on a narrow ledge overlooking a dry riverbed, Priscilla was cornered. Silas stood before her, his horse blocking the path. He had a gun in his hand. Heath raised his hand, signaling his men to stop. A direct charge would be suicide. Priscilla was too close. Silas could shoot her before they ever reached him. He had to do this alone. He dismounted, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. He began to move forward on foot, using the rocks for cover, circling around to get a better angle. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying their voices to him. "Give me the valise, Miss Anderson," Silas was saying, his voice calm, almost conversational. "It's over. There's nowhere left for you to run." "You'll kill me anyway." Priscilla's voice was steady, defiant. She was still holding the reins of her horse, the heavy valise strapped to the saddle. "Perhaps," Silas admitted, "but your death will be quick. If you make this difficult, it will be slow and painful." Heath raised his rifle, resting it on a rock. He centered the sight on Silas's chest. It was a long shot. The wind was tricky. "Last chance," Silas said, raising his pistol. And then Priscilla did something Heath never would have expected. She wasn't a damsel in distress waiting to be rescued. She was a fighter. With a sudden sharp cry, she yanked hard on the reins of her horse, spinning the animal around. The horse, spooked and panicked, reared up, its front hooves lashing out. At the same time, she unbuckled the strap holding the valise. The heavy case tumbled from the saddle, not onto the ledge, but over the edge, falling down into the rocky canyon below. Silas screamed in rage. For a split second, his attention was diverted. He glanced down at the falling valise, his prize, his one objective, now lost. It was the only opening Heath needed. He fired. The rifle shot echoed through the canyon like a crack of thunder. Silas jerked backward, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. His pistol went off, the bullet whining harmlessly into the sky. He staggered for a moment on the edge of the ledge, his face a mask of shock, before he toppled over, following the valise into the depths of the canyon. Silence fell. Heath ran forward, his heart in his throat. Priscilla stood frozen, her hand still on the reins of her trembling horse. Her face was ashen. "Priscilla!" he called out. She looked up, her eyes finding his. The strength that had held her up seemed to drain away. Her knees buckled. He caught her just as she fell, pulling her into his arms. She was shaking uncontrollably. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair. "It's over," he whispered. "It's over. You're safe." She buried her face in his chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He just held her, standing on that lonely ledge under the vast Wyoming sky, the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air. The storm had passed. They buried Silas in the canyon where he fell. No one in town asked any questions. A man from the east had come looking for trouble, and in the west, when you found trouble, it often buried you. The valise was recovered, its contents intact. Heath looked at the ledgers and letters, the proof of a powerful man's corruption. "What should we do with these?" he asked Priscilla. They were sitting on the porch of the main house, the evening sun casting long shadows across the valley. "Burn them," she said without hesitation. "My life in Boston is over. I don't want any part of it following me here ever again." That night they built a bonfire. They fed the papers to the flames, page by page, watching as the evidence of Alistair Finch's crimes turned to ash and drifted away on the wind. It was a funeral for her old life and a baptism for her new one. As the last page burned, a comfortable silence settled between them. They had been through a crucible, a trial by fire. The mail order arrangement, the polite fiction they had started with, had burned away with the papers. What was left was something real, something forged in danger and trust. "The guest cabin is yours for as long as you want it," Heath said softly, breaking the silence. "No questions, no expectations." She turned to him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "I don't want the guest cabin, Heath." He looked at her, his heart suddenly beating a little faster. "I came west looking for a partnership," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "I was looking for a home. I think I found it, if the offer still stands." Heath reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapped around hers. "The offer will always stand, Priscilla." He stood up and pulled her to her feet. He looked down at the woman who had turned his life upside down, the woman who was braver and stronger than anyone he had ever known. The woman he was, he realized with a startling clarity, completely in love with. He didn't say the words, not yet. Instead, he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't like the first, hesitant kiss they had shared. This was a kiss of promise, of homecoming. A kiss that sealed a partnership that had nothing to do with letters or arrangements. When they broke apart, she was smiling, a real, genuine smile that finally reached her sage-green eyes. "I should warn you," he said, his own lips curving into a smile. "I'm not an easy man to live with. I'm stubborn." "I've noticed," she said, her smile widening. "But I'm not the demure Eastern flower you thought you were getting either." "No," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not. You're so much more." They were married a month later, in the small church in Willow Creek. The whole town came. Benjamin, the station master, stood as Heath's best man. Mrs. Winters wept with joy. Priscilla didn't wear a fancy dress from Boston. She wore a simple cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, with wildflowers tucked into her hair. As she walked down the aisle toward him, Heath knew that waiting 91 days at that train station had been the smartest thing he had ever done. That night, as they stood on the porch of their home, now truly their home, Priscilla leaned her head on his shoulder. "What do you think our life will be like?" she asked. "Not always easy," he said honestly, "but it won't be boring." She laughed, a clear, happy sound that echoed in the quiet night. "No, I don't suppose it will be." He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. The cowboy had waited at the depot. He hadn't found the woman he was expecting. He had found the woman he was meant for, a partner, a fighter, a survivor, his wife, his home. He had waited for a ghost and found his whole world. What do you think? Was Heath right to trust her? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the Wild West.